She handed me the papers at my own retirement party. Not at home. Not in private. Not with the kind of quiet that a marriage ending deserves. She did it in the banquet room of the Riverside Grill in Columbus, Ohio, in front of 43 years of colleagues, neighbors, and people who had known us since our daughter was in diapers. My son-in-law was standing 12 feet away, holding a glass of champagne that he hadn't touched. My daughter was near the gift table, laughing at something her friend said. And my wife of 31 years slid a manila envelope across the white tablecloth and said, quietly, but not quietly enough, "I think it's time we both moved on, Warren." Not honey, not the nickname she'd used since 1994, Warren. The envelope had my full name typed on the label, Warren H. Caldwell. The H felt particularly cold. I looked at her. She was wearing the blue dress she'd bought for our 25th anniversary dinner. I always thought she looked beautiful in that dress. She still did. I set my fork down and picked up the envelope and turned it over once in my hands, and I smiled. Not because I was happy. Not because it didn't hurt. I smiled because, standing in that room with 40 years of my professional life behind me, and nothing but open road ahead, I finally understood something I had been slow to see. I had been ready for this for 3 years. Let me back up. I spent 38 years as a hospital system administrator in Columbus. I wasn't a doctor. I wasn't the face anyone recognized in a waiting room. I was the man who made sure the waiting room existed, that it was staffed and funded, and that the lights stayed on and the contracts held. I oversaw facility operations, vendor negotiations, capital expansion projects, and the kind of budget restructuring that nobody wanted to deal with, but everybody needed someone to handle. My wife came into hospital administration from the clinical side. She had been a registered nurse for 15 years before she moved into management. Sharp mind, natural with people. She rose fast once she had the right platform. When she was appointed Deputy Director of Patient Services at Mercy General 8 years ago, I was the one who had quietly advocated for her internally, not because she was my wife, but because she was genuinely the best candidate. For a while that felt like partnership. Then the hospital brought in a consultant from Chicago to assess executive talent and succession potential. His name was Spencer Cross. Mid-40s, wore linen shirts in October, had opinions about everything. He told my wife she had the instincts of a visionary and the institutional weight of a legacy system holding her back. I don't know exactly when she started believing him. I just know that somewhere in the last few years of my career, I became part of the legacy system. I noticed the small things first. Meetings I used to be copied on where my name disappeared from the thread. A leadership forum she attended in Phoenix, where she introduced herself as building her own lane in hospital administration. A Sunday dinner where she mentioned, almost casually, that Spencer thought she should position herself as independent of any single institution. Independent. There was a particular board dinner, 2 years before my retirement, where a trustee leaned over and said to me, "Your wife is going to run this place someday. You must be proud." I told him I was. And I was. But I also noticed that when he said it, my wife, who was standing right there, smiled without looking at me. A year later, she was appointed Chief Operating Officer of Mercy General. I attended the announcement reception. I stood in the back and watched her thank the board, thank the administrative team, thank Spencer Cross for his mentorship. She did not thank me. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about the board presentations I had helped her prepare at our kitchen table, the performance metrics she had used to make her case for the COO role, metrics that came directly from the operational restructuring I had designed and implemented in the South Wing 3 years prior. She presented them well. I'll give her that. She always knew how to make a room feel like the information was hers. That night, after she fell asleep, I opened my laptop and drafted a document I had been postponing for 2 years. I called it Caldwell Consultancy, and I filed it with the state of Ohio the following Thursday. It wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was prudence. I had spent enough years watching what happened to people in institutional administration who assumed their value was understood. I had seen good men and women walk out of hospitals after decades of service with nothing but a plaque and a dwindling pension. I was not going to be one of them. Over the next 2 years, I quietly built what I needed to build. The critical piece was something I had negotiated 7 years earlier, long before any of this. A vendor services framework for specialty equipment procurement. 3 major medical suppliers had signed long-term consulting agreements that ran through my name specifically, not through Mercy General, because the hospital's legal team at the time had allowed personal expertise clauses as a cost-saving measure. It was a standard enough arrangement for senior administrators with outside expertise. The board had approved it. The CFO had signed off. Everyone had called it sensible. Nobody called it sensible. Nobody called it significant until it became inconvenient. By the time my retirement party arrived, Caldwell Consultancy held active consulting agreements with 4 major vendors, representing roughly 30% of Mercy General's specialized procurement budget. Not hidden, not secret, filed with the state, disclosed to the board, signed by all relevant parties, just quiet, the way I had always worked. The envelope she slid across that table at the Riverside Grill contained divorce papers dated 3 days after she had been internally recommended for president and CEO of Mercy General, pending official board vote. That vote was scheduled for the following Monday. I knew about the recommendation before she told me. I found out the same way I found out most things in that building, through the people who actually ran operations day to day. I smiled at her across that table and I said, "I understand." She had expected something else. I could see it in the small tightening around her eyes. She expected me to make a scene, or plead, or at least look shattered. Instead, I tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of my suit jacket, picked up my fork, and finished my dinner. Our daughter noticed something was wrong by dessert. She pulled me aside near the coat check, her hand on my arm, her voice careful the way it gets when she's worried, but doesn't want to alarm me. "Dad, are you okay?" I thought about that question for a moment. "I will be," I said. She studied my face the way she has since she was a teenager, looking for the version of me that lies to protect people. I must have looked steady enough because she let it go. The drive home that night was quiet. My wife and I rode in the same car because that is what you do when you have been married 31 years and your entire social circle is watching. She looked out the passenger window the whole way. The Columbus skyline does not ask anything of you. It just sits there, useful and indifferent. "You're not going to fight this," she said. Not a question. "No," I said. "Good." And then, after a long pause, "I didn't want to hurt you, Warren." I kept my eyes on the road. "I know." What I didn't say was that her hurting me was the least of what I was thinking about. The following Monday, I was sitting at my desk in the spare bedroom I had converted into a proper home office during the pandemic. Coffee going cold, legal pad open, when my phone rang. It was the director of supply chain operations at Mercy General, a man I had worked alongside for 11 years. "Warren," he said, "I just got an email from administration saying our point of contact for the Hartley & Associates agreement has changed. They're saying all procurement inquiries go through the new COO office now." He paused. "But the contract header says Caldwell Consultancy. That hasn't changed, has it?" "No," I said, "it hasn't." "Then I'm not sure what they're telling me to do." "Call me directly," I said, "the way you always have." By noon, I had received 3 similar calls, 2 from vendor account managers, 1 from the regional director of a medical equipment distributor I had personally brought into the Mercy General network 6 years earlier. All of them had received polished, official-looking emails redirecting communication to the new administration. None of those emails mentioned the actual contract structure. My phone rang again at 12:47. I recognized her cell. "Warren," she said. Her voice had the careful control she used in board settings, not the voice I had fallen in love with in 1993 at a hospital administration conference in Cincinnati. "I've been reviewing vendor agreements this morning, and I need to understand something." "What would you like to understand? Why are 4 procurement contracts showing Caldwell Consultancy as primary consultant, your LLC?" "Because that's how they were structured," I said. 7 years ago, board approved. There was a silence that felt longer than it probably was. "You did this on purpose." "I filed the consultancy and negotiated the contracts while I was your colleague and your husband," I said. "The paperwork is accurate." "Warren, have you read the assignment clauses?" I asked. Another silence. "No," she finally said. "I'd recommend it." I set the phone down and looked at the framed photograph on my desk. It's a picture from 2003. My daughter is about 7 years old in it. My wife and I are standing on either side of her in front of a lake cabin we rented in Michigan for a week every August back then. We look happy. We were happy. I keep the photo not out of sentimentality, exactly, but because it reminds me that whatever went wrong between us, something had once been real. That afternoon, I called my attorney, a woman named Judith who had handled my estate planning for 12 years and who had, at my request, quietly reviewed the Caldwell consultancy structure twice in the past 2 years. "They'll want a meeting," she said. "I'm sure they will. Are you going? Send my regrets." The emergency board meeting was called for Wednesday morning. I learned about it through the same supply chain director who had called me Monday. He was there because 3 board members had specifically requested that someone from operations explain the contractual architecture before any decisions were made. Judith attended as my legal representative. She called me at 11:15 that morning. "Well," I said, "your wife opened the meeting by describing the situation as a potential conflict of interest requiring immediate resolution," she said. "She framed it as your contracts having been structured to undermine institutional continuity." And the board, 2 of the older trustees, Garland and Pratt, asked to see the original approval minutes. Once those were distributed, the conversation shifted considerably. I walked to the window. The street outside was quiet for a Wednesday. Leaves coming down from the oak by the curb. "What kind of shift?" I asked. They read the primary contractor language aloud, Warren. Out loud in the room. "Caldwell Consultancy, LLC, Primary Strategic Consultant, Mercy General Hospital System, Fulfillment and Operational Partner," Garland said, and I'm quoting him. "This is the most organized exit strategy I've ever seen from someone who wasn't planning to exit." I almost laughed. "They asked her whether she had reviewed the vendor contract architecture before recommending your transition into retirement," Judith continued. "What did she say?" "That she had relied on executive summaries." There it was. "The board is not angry, Warren," Judith said carefully. "They're concerned. There's a difference. They're asking what happens to those 4 vendor relationships if Caldwell Consultancy chooses to discontinue cooperation." "What did you tell them?" "That Caldwell Consultancy has no obligation to discontinue, but it also has no obligation to continue under the current terms." A pause. "They're drafting a proposal," she said. "I figured. A formal consulting partnership, multi-year, guaranteed retainer, performance incentives, and..." She stopped briefly. "They want to discuss an advisory seat on the Capital Projects Committee." I sat down slowly. They removed me from the building on a Friday, and now they want to pay me to advise them on Tuesday. "That's a fair summary," Judith said. "What does she say about the proposal?" "She objected initially, said it complicates her authority." "And the board's position?" Judith's voice was measured. "That authority, unsupported by operational continuity, is ceremonial." I let that sit for a moment. "Tell them I'll review the proposal," I said, "but I'm not coming back to work inside that building." That evening my daughter called. She had heard from her mother. Her voice was careful again, that same careful register I recognized from the coat check on Saturday night. "Dad, I don't even know how to ask this. Did you know she was going to do this at the party? I suspected something was coming, I said. I didn't know the timing. And the contracts, the consultancy thing, she stopped. How long have you been building that? A few years. Silence on her end. Were you protecting yourself? Yes. From Mom? I chose my words slowly. From the possibility of being left with nothing to show for 38 years of work, I said. I wasn't planning to fight her, sweetheart. I was planning not to disappear. She didn't say anything for a long moment. I think, she said finally, her voice quieter. I think she made a mistake. She made several, I said gently. So did I. That's the honest version. I don't want to make my wife into a villain. That would be easy, and it would be incomplete. She is a talented administrator. She is a good mother. What happened between us had been happening slowly for years, the way a foundation shifts not from one earthquake, but from 100 small settlements you don't notice until the floor is uneven. She wanted to be seen as something she built herself. I understand that. I even respect it. What I couldn't make peace with was that her version of independence required erasing the years I had spent, being the infrastructure she stood on. We do not stop being people when we become professionals. The proposal from the board arrived the following Friday. My attorney and I reviewed it over 2 hours at her office in Grandview Heights. The retainer was generous. The scope was appropriate. The advisory committee seat was, frankly, more interesting to me than the money. But I had a counter. I did not want to be retained by Mercy General as an individual. I wanted Caldwell Consultancy contracted as an independent strategic partner with full autonomy over staffing and methodology. I wanted a 3-year term, renewable by mutual agreement, with a clause that severed the arrangement cleanly if either party chose not to continue. No institutional entanglement, no ambiguity about whose name was on what. I wanted, in other words, to be a partner, not an employee who had simply been repackaged. The board accepted the counter within a week. My wife and I have not spoken at length since the party. We have exchanged practical communications through attorneys, through our daughter, and once in person in the driveway of the house we still share, pending the finalization of the sale. She was getting into her car. I was coming back from a walk. We stood for a moment in the thin Ohio November light. You could have told me, she said. I told you I was building something, I said. You told me retirement projects were for men who couldn't let go. She looked away briefly. I said that. You did. I thought you were just. She stopped. I thought you were coasting. I know, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Not with anger now. With something more complicated and harder to name. You never coasted a day in your life, did you? She said. It wasn't exactly a question. No, I said quietly. I just didn't make noise about it. She got into her car. I finished my walk. I won't pretend the divorce isn't painful. 31 years is not nothing. The house we sold, we had lived in for 24 of those years. The oak tree in the front yard, my daughter used to climb it when she was 9 and scare the life out of both of us. Those things don't become irrelevant because a marriage ends. They just become past. What I can tell you is that the morning I signed the consulting agreement with Mercy General, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, in the way it always does, because I always forget to drink it while it's hot, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Solid. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just solid, the way a well-built structure feels when you press your hand against a load-bearing wall and there's nothing soft about it. Caldwell Consultancy now has 3 associates, 2 of whom I recruited from the operational staff at Mercy General. People who had worked alongside me for the better part of a decade, and who reached out when word circulated that I was building something independent. My daughter jokes that I am finally running the company I always should have started in my 60s instead of my late 60s. She's probably right. My son-in-law, who is a quiet and careful man and who I like more every year, said something to me over Thanksgiving that I've thought about since. We were washing dishes together while the rest of the family watched football in the other room. He said, "I never understood why you stayed in the background so long." I dried a plate and considered that. "I didn't think I was in the background," I said. "I thought I was in the foundation." He thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I can see that. There is a version of this story where I am bitter, where what my wife did at that restaurant becomes the defining injury of my later years, something I carry around and show people the way you show a scar, to explain a limp. I have chosen a different version, not because I am a particularly enlightened person, because at 63 years old I do not have the patience or the interest in being defined by someone else's decision about my value. She thought she was closing a chapter. What she did not account for was that I had already started writing the next one. The vendor agreements are renewed. The consultancy is profitable. The advisory committee work, which I attend quarterly in the same building I spent 4 decades in, is the most interesting professional engagement I've had since the late 90s. I sit at that table as myself now, not as anyone's support structure, not as the engine behind someone else's shine. I drove past the Riverside Grill last week. They've changed the outdoor signage. Looks different. I slowed down for a moment, not out of grief, just to look. There's something about the place where your old life ended that deserves at least a glance as you pass by. Then I kept driving. If this story found you, if you have ever spent years building something only to have someone decide that what you built was theirs to take, I want you to know something. The work was real. The preparation was real. And the morning you decide to stop proving your value to someone who stopped counting it, that morning is the beginning, not the end. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're building. The quiet ones are always building something. I keep thinking about something my son-in-law said at the kitchen sink on Thanksgiving. He asked me why I stayed in the background so long. And I told him I didn't think I was in the background. I thought I was in the foundation. That distinction took me 60 years to understand clearly, and it cost me a marriage to say out loud. What happened with my wife wasn't a single bad decision. It was the result of something that had been building for a long time. Choices made and unmade, small erosions of honesty that accumulate the way silt does, quietly until the riverbed has changed and you don't recognize the water anymore. She made her choices. I made mine. The difference is that mine were made with eyes open, and hers were made with the assumption that I would not be paying attention. That assumption was the seed of everything that followed. I have been asked, since all of this became known to the people around me, whether I was angry. The honest answer is that I was, for a time, but anger was not what built Caldwell Consultancy. Anger does not draft contract language or negotiate vendor clauses or file correctly with the state of Ohio. What built that was something steadier than anger. It was the decision, made quietly and without announcement, to treat myself as someone worth protecting. That is not a small thing. Most people I know spent decades treating their own interests as negotiable. I had done the same for most of my career. At some point in my late 50s, I stopped. There is a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with credentials. It's the intelligence that watches how systems actually work, not how they're described on paper, and builds accordingly. I watched the hospital for 38 years. I watched who got credited and who got overlooked. I watched how succession was discussed and what was assumed about who would survive it. I was not cynical about what I saw. I was educated by it. Preparation is not betrayal. It is the honest response to living in a world where nothing is guaranteed, including the loyalty of people who love you. What I did not do, and this matters to me more than the outcome, was act dishonestly. Every document was filed, every contract was disclosed, Every board member had signed what they later claimed to have forgotten. I did not scheme, I structured. There is a difference. And I know the difference because I had to look at myself in the mirror during those years and ask whether I was being the kind of man I wanted to be. The answer had to be yes, not because I was afraid of consequences, but because integrity is the one thing that cannot be restructured once it's gone. My wife lost something when she handed me those papers in that restaurant, and it was not me. It was her own credibility and her own account of herself. 31 years, a retirement party, a manila envelope. These are the facts of how it ended. But here's what I know now, standing on the other side. What she intended as a closing was actually an opening. She thought she was ending a chapter for both of us. What she did not understand was that I had already turned the page. The consultancy is real. The work is real. The people who chose to come with me made that choice freely, and I do not take it lightly. Every morning I sit down at that desk in what used to be a spare bedroom, and I think about what it means to have built something that belongs entirely to yourself. Not inherited, not granted, earned, the way things only feel earned, when you have done the quiet, unglamorous, long work of preparation that nobody applauded because nobody knew it was happening. That is the only kind of foundation worth standing on.